As a transaction coordinator, your job is to keep the transaction flowing smoothly from the accepted offer to the closing date. Deadlines, communication, timely tasks. You have to stay on top of it all. tcDocs is highly customizable to the way you work. By taking the time to set up your checklist, you will ensure a deadline or milestone will never go unchecked. We will start by building a checklist of the transaction activities you want to track. Here's an example transaction checklist as it looks in tcDocs. Do you see any task descriptions that you are likely to have on your checklist? Let's create a transaction checklist template. Click the 3 gears icon, Templates, Checklists. Add New, and name it. Select Transactions. Now you can click Back or click Add Task. Click Add Task to get started. Let's add a task to reflect the due date of the earnest money deposit. The driver is what triggers the task. In this case, the mutual acceptance triggers the earnest money deposit. Duration is how many days after the driver that this task is due. Let's say that the earnest money deposit is usually due 3 days after an accepted contract. Is this a milestone? Let's say yes, because it's an important deadline in the transaction. Both the buyer and seller side need to stay on top of the earnest money deposit due date, so let's indicate that it applies to buyer and seller. And as a milestone, it will be added to a shareable branded transaction summary. When you start a transaction, you can always edit the tasks for the transaction. So don't worry if you need to say, for example, change the earnest money deposit due date for a particular transaction. Save and close. You have your first task. This road icon indicates that it's a milestone. The driver, MA, is the mutual acceptance date. The days is how many days after the driver that this task is due. And both indicates that it will be imported into both the buyer and seller represented transactions. Now let's add a task that we only want imported to buyer side transactions. Let's say your client, the agent, wants you to remind buyers to set up their homeowner's insurance 2 weeks before their closing date. Click Add Task. This time the driver is going to be the closing date. With the closing date, the duration is the number of days before the date. So enter 14. This will only be imported to the checklist when representing the buyer. This is not a milestone. Key tasks are similar to milestones. Milestones appear at the top of the transaction summaries and status emails, and key tasks at the bottom of summaries and in the body of status emails. Save and close. The key icon represents that this is a key task. The driver is the closing day. This will be due 14 days before the closing day. Notice the PC. This signifies parent and child tasks. Let's take a look at how those work. Let's create a task to send the buyer's signed offer to the seller for signature. The driver is the mutual acceptance. This isn't a milestone. And this isn't a task you want to appear on the status report. This is a task related to seller representation. Once the seller signs the contract, you need to send the executed contract back to the buyer agent. This task is dependent on you first getting the seller's signature. So, create a child task. This means it's dependent on another task. Click Add Child Task. The parent task automatically populates as the driving task. The driver is another task. Leave duration at 0 days. The milestone, key, type, and applies to default to those of the parent task. Notice that a P and C now appear for parent and child task. Note, if you delete a parent task, the child tasks will also be deleted. Click on P or C to filter the view to just see that family of related tasks. As you're developing your checklist template, you can easily reorder tasks. You can easily duplicate checklists and add custom tasks for the different realtors that you work with. You can also create short checklists for a series of tasks that are not always needed, like for an inspection contingency. You can import it into a transaction when it is needed. Think of it as a modular approach, completely flexible and adaptable to your needs.